All right, so this is the Great OST Debate, a soundtrack for the modern age of security. So first, let's start with who I am. I'm Dumby. I'm a blue teamer. I do corporate security engineering and live for defensive security. I focus on corporate environments and have my roots in SOC work. I'm a longtime member of DC 801 and really love being part of the hacking community on Twitter, SLC, Saint, and beyond. So why this topic? OST, offensive security tooling, has been a topic of discussion that I've seen evolving over time, and I find the passionate discourse fascinating. I thought it was worth capturing the essence of what I've experienced in the debate and try to give some appreciation to those who I consider as advancing the state of security via community. It can also be kind of hard to find references to this on Twitter, as OST unfortunately shares an acronym with original soundtrack, which is the pun behind the title of the talk. I've got a large collection of OST-related tweets from a large variety of folks. I'll release a complimentary post that has a reference to them, as well as links to particular people I'd like to thank for their constructive participation. So OST is a very divisive topic. A common sentiment I find is that we've already had these conversations or solved the problem, but you can still find Twitter conversations almost daily on it. I think solving is an ignorant view that doesn't appreciate just how broad the security industry has become and that we are an increasingly diverse profession with an awesome level of fresh perspectives all the time. So while I provide my personal perspective in this discussion, I think it's important to appreciate and understand a lot of the different viewpoints as they've evolved through time. So what is offensive security tooling? How is it defined? For me, any program or tooling whose creation is centered on giving attackers additional capability to breach and persist in an organization's computer systems and networks. So these could be private or public tools released or used by APT simulations, red teams, defenders, and criminals. This is a great area of debate. One approach taken by Andrew Thompson is to utilize function and stated intent. Do the authors themselves state it's a red team or offensive tool? Does it implement evasive features and stealth features designed to thwart defenses? This is up to personal interpretation, but I believe there are some solid attributes to pull from while you decide for yourself. So we can do some quick examples of some examples of OST that most of us, or many of us, will be familiar with. Recently, the FireEye OST was announced. So when FireEye was recently compromised, the attackers got a hold of a trove of scripts and tooling that FireEye used in their red team engagements. It was described by Mandia himself as this. The stolen tools range from simple scripts used for automating reconnaissance to entire frameworks that are similar to publicly available technologies such as Cobalt Strike and Metasploit. Many of the red team tools have already been released to the community and are already distributed in our open source virtual machine, Commando VM. Some of these tools are publicly available tools modified to evade basic security detection and mechanisms. Other tools and frameworks were developed in-house for our red team. Another example is Cobalt Strike. So released by the famous hacker Mudge as an adversary simulation suite in 2012, it's now infamous in the world as a common component of cybercrime. Cobalt Strike is a very important tool in the OST topic and is an entire discussion in and of itself. It will come up a few times throughout this talk. To summarize, it is a full suite of tools focused around compromising systems, command, control, and persistence. It has many advanced evasion features to avoid defenses such as C2 cloaking and obfuscation. Metasploit. In the same family as Cobalt Strike is Metasploit. Created by H.D. Moore in 2003, it was acquired by Rapid7 in 2009. After you've determined a system may be vulnerable to compromise, it is one of the best tools out there for selecting a particular exploit, tuning its parameters, and deploying while also waiting to catch a reverse shell so you can communicate back in and have more fun on the system you now own. Even an offensive noob like myself can use it to simply select Eternal Blue, point it at a vulnerable system, change a couple of options, and have a shell a few moments after hitting go. It removes many of the sharp edges of exploit deployment and the all-important aspect of managing your reverse shell. Large repositories of easily weaponized exploits are deployed as part of the tool and are available through the community. Some other tools that fall into more of a gray territory, whereas those are pretty obviously used for attackers, one is Bloodhound. So it is an amazing tool. Elegant in design, simple in use, and extremely powerful. It provides a simple and clear results with beautiful use of graph theory on top of all that. A simple set of unobtrusive queries to AD can unearth offensive paths for complete ownership of a domain. It does no damage itself and only exposes information that any computers on the domain already has access to. Is it dangerous? In the wrong hands, absolutely. But it's also a useful way for defensive security engineers such as myself to find weaknesses in our AD protections, where to shore up passwords, and tighten up security policies while also presenting no real risk directly to the environment. Mimikatz is another tool that you can't help but celebrate. Technically labeled by the authors a Windows security research tool, it is one of the most common components of computer compromise. It's jam-packed with constantly increasing amounts of features which give it the ability to exploit and take advantage of Windows mechanisms that help defeat security of the Windows environment. Famously, it can pull hashes and clear text credentials from a system. One of its most recent set of features exploit the vulnerabilities of Print Nightmare, which provides direct paths for privilege escalation and remote code execution. Using Mimikatz is as simple as downloading a binary, running it in command prompt, and guiding through its prompts. It also is easily utilized in automated attacks and can be deployed in memory without leaving a footprint on disk, which further expands its usefulness for malicious purposes. So why is OST a big deal? A lot of amazing research and effort goes into the development of this tooling, and it's a huge area of focus for researchers, organizations, and criminals alike. It enables red teams to perform in-depth simulations of adversary capability, but also makes that functionality available to criminals who are interested in using them to cause harm. What happens when groundbreaking technology is released for the attackers? An example I recently took notice of was Scythe releasing an in-memory implementation of CPython that was released at the Usenix Workshop on Offensive Technologies in 2021. Let's do a quick overview of why that was created. As part of post-exploitation, Python scripts play a huge role in compromise and affords a lot of direct access to the OS and easy to use in expectable ways. The problem is that it's not commonly deployed on systems you may land on after compromise. Installing Python itself creates a lot of noise and leaves forensic markers. What if you could take those existing scripts and then run them directly in memory without touching the disks or looking out of place beyond running an arbitrary C program? It's pretty cool. It is an amazing tool. A ton of incredible work obviously went into it. However, I am critical since this is a tool whose entire creation is intended to aid attackers in effective attacking while deeply evading standard defenses. I think it's worth discussing the ethical conflicts in a company that profits off providing security services while also potentially enabling criminals with advanced technology that is available for free with zero barriers. The source code for this OST is available on GitHub and ready to use by anyone. DetectPod in January of 2020 did a really great episode called Dead OST Society that discussed the OST debate. They mentioned a takeaway point that I thought was really cognizant. We created these tools to emulate attackers, and now attackers are using these tools to emulate us. And so that brings us to intent. What is the intent? This is where, for me, it gets a bit tricky, personalized, and difficult to contextualize. Many releases of tools which support offensive capabilities are created by independent researchers looking deeply into technology and finding interesting ways to use and/or abuse it. This includes evading AV, avoiding forensic markers, or hiding communications. I personally would love to see more public research into EDR evasions, which helps defenders better assess how much we trust in their capabilities. Often the idea with releasing OST publicly is that it gives defensive organizations the opportunity to see real-world attacks closely simulated by these tools or similar ones without having to create it themselves. When you live in the realm of defending against APT, that argument probably holds a lot of water. However, when we're talking small business and even small enterprise, especially government and nonprofit organizations, it's just not a reality that you can do this because it's enough of a struggle to run the business, let alone explore specialized skill sets, which OST often require. Putting my personal spin on things, the level of capability afforded to your common attackers wasn't available until it was presented by the security community as fully fledged open source tooling. Criminals would have to create, buy, or steal these tools themselves without many of these public OST projects. If you are interested in OST or exploit development, I think it's important that you ask yourself, why are you doing this? Whose interest is it in? Is it to learn more for yourself? Is it to share techniques with the community, break down barriers of research, break down barriers which provide false sense of security, create something that causes havoc in the world? I won't pass judgment of what your reasons are, but I ask that you at least consider what your intent is. So who is responsible and how can we do better as a community? It's an eternal question and one that we must view and attack from every angle with cooperation across the board. I don't think there is any one thing to blame here. One common proposal I've seen defenders pitch is that offensive capabilities should be paired with defensive measures. If you release a new way to evade traditional defenses, but know of a way that your tool leaves a mark, provide a list of the IOCs that defenders can easily implement into their existing workflows. Your average defensive security team does not have the authority, capability, or knowledge of how to apply these tools. It's a false premise to think that just because releasing the ability for anyone to run these tools means that security teams will be able to do so and implement mitigations through personal means. So just because you're releasing it doesn't mean people know how to actually effectively use it. We're all in this together. We need to advance the state of the art to meet the increasingly complex technology landscape, but also be hesitant to introduce capabilities that attackers can directly utilize to perpetuate cyber attacks. Is regulation the answer? That's a common concern in the community. If we do anything to restrict OST, does that contribute to gatekeeping and allowing security practitioners to gain experience and exposure? I think most of us would agree that any single government agency or official organization determining who has access to OST is not in the best interest of anyone in the security community. Could these developers self-regulate? Cobalt Strike has attempted to self-regulate their own tool through licensing, but criminals reliably crack the keys and are able to bypass those restrictions. With this being the reality, criminals can reliably use Cobalt Strike, while it's only legitimate defenders who are truly blocked from using the tool for testing and assessment of their systems. Regulation is definitely a double-edged sword. So, can this help defenders? Does it hurt them? A common suggestion that I find myself in agreement with is that developers of OST should be just as interested in detection of their tools and techniques as much as their success in the field. As they develop and test, it's common for authors to discover fingerprints and breadcrumbs they leave behind. Those can be collected and released with their tools. In my opinion, this is true security research and what most authors should strive for. However, there is contention in this idea. Are defenders really improving their defenses simply by adding a new batch of IOCs to their endpoint detection systems? Or is it better to prove the ability for a blue team to proactively engage in defenses against the tactics, which is actually a key signifier of truly advanced defensive capabilities? So what are we really trying to expose, the known or the unknown? One of the oldest security tropes is that defenders know what we should be doing. We just don't have the capability or authority to implement due to any number of organizational or technical obstacles. If we can safely use something that proves what we already know, I would consider that beneficial. If all we're doing is showing things that we have no ability to protect against and it just makes us fear more, I don't really know if that's productive for defense. So I think it's important that no single voice or opinion dominates the discussion, nor is this an issue that can be solved. This is a perpetual debate and one that will always need to be reviewed and addressed. I want everyone to be equipped with information about what the arguments are and encouragement to provide their own influence, whether you're for, against, or just curious about offensive security capabilities. This debate has been raging for many, many years with many participants in many different forums. It picks up intensity, becoming a topic of flaring discussion before dying down again. The most prevalent sentiment that I find is exhaustion of the debate, and that's okay. Those who have been key to the conversation in the past should be free to bow out and allow the conversation to continue with new and diverse voices. It can be difficult to do that if we don't have a good perspective on what has already been discussed or an understanding of why it's such a problem in the real world beyond the Twitter echo chamber. GitHub recently did some interesting stuff. They polled the community on policy changes regarding exploit hosting, and that could feed down to OSTs as well. Should it be allowed on their platform? Should these projects be tagged as somehow as potentially malicious? When FireEye was breached and their OST was released, leaked, they quickly released IOCs, which allowed the creation of rules to detect any of the use of their tools, which at that point would be unauthorized. It was a great move by the company and shows the importance of creating those IOC and having them available as an additional responsibility of creating and using these tools. What can we do? And again, as a community, this is what I like to look at. Keep the conversation alive and hack the planet responsibly. Pressure organizations who enable OST into developing ability for meaningful defenses. GitHub essentially acts as a malware CDN, with attackers commonly directly loading from public repositories. GitHub is reviewing how policy can be adapted to manage the presence of these tools on their platform, and that can turn into whole solutions that defensive teams can implement. One very thorough, well-intentioned, and realistic approach was given by Swift on Security. As I mentioned earlier, GitHub is working with the community to develop policy on how they might be able to segment and segregate offensive or exploits, offensive tooling or exploits on their platform. So with that, it provides a real pathway to clearly labeling and segmenting OST, which allows both supporting security research and giving defenders potential ways to mitigate exploits coming from GitHub. Is this a perfect fix? Absolutely not, but nothing in security is, and it could push the state of the art forward. Defenders love easily implemented and maintained layers, and if you could just say, here's a whole subnet or subdomain of GitHub that you can just block at your firewalls, that's a pretty easy layer to maintain. Redefine the purpose and intent of teams that could utilize such capabilities. Red teaming is a very distinct discipline beyond offensive security umbrella. Within an organization, it's not as simple as blue versus red battling it out. Often, offensive security engineers are verifying security, not acting as adversaries. So I think it's worth doing a bit of a deep dive into Cobalt Strike because, like I mentioned earlier, it's so prevalent in the discussion about what OST is and what impact it has on the world. It has become one of the most prevalent names of the OST world for a long time now. Well, in a perfect world, we would have defenses that cover every layer of protection that Cobalt Strike breaks through. And it would only be effective as a verification of defenses. Unfortunately, things aren't perfect. ZDNet reported on research from Recorded Future in January of 2021, and they found the following. They said it tracked more than 10,000 malware CNC servers that year across more than 80 different malware strains. Two of the penetration testing toolkits have now become the top two most widely used technologies for hosting malware CNC servers, namely Cobalt Strike, which had 13.5% of all 2020 malware CNC servers, and Metasploit, which had 10.5% of them. So released in 2012, Cobalt Strike is the big brother of Armitage, which was a GUI tool for Metasploit. Intel 471 released a report in May of 2021 that does a wonderful job of tracking its history and some technical details of real-world use by attackers, particularly used by TrickBot since 2019. TrickBot is a modular malware enterprise. Malware authors develop this suite of tools and then license its use to criminals who then can take advantage of its ability to compromise systems and provide the secondary services such as command and control, commonly utilizing Cobalt Strike as one of those modular components. Leslie Carhart recently posted an awesome Twitter thread discussing Cobalt Strike in detail, and I have a few particular quotes that I liked. Cobalt Strike relies heavily on C2 beaconing. Yes, you can build fancy profiles that look like Amazon or Pandora. Yes, it can beacon at irregular intervals. However, C2 rules still apply. And a lot of adversaries, they use the defaults. Detecting HTTP, HTTPS, DNS-C2, that's a start. So summary of Cobalt Strike. The creator of Cobalt Strike is a good dude. It seriously sucks it's been stolen and repurposed. It's a really cool framework. It's a huge sandbox and nobody can claim to detect every configuration. Some defaults and behaviors, though, out of the box you can catch. Coverage across the kill chain, host, and network is a really important in catching more sophisticated attacks like this. If you catch one small component of Cobalt Strike, like lateral movement or an injected process, you can start to pull the thread and really unravel exactly what's happening with that attack. Consider dedicated threat hypotheses for Cobalt Strike, TTPs, techniques, and tactics in your environment. It's not just a cheaty way to catch the red team anymore. It's really being abused by a lot of bad guys and oftentimes very clumsily. So some takeaways. There is a place for OST, but I ask that we're all realistic about the impacts of their existence. I won't deny that blue teams can learn from these tools. I definitely have myself. The OST debate is not a simple one, and there isn't any single solution. I don't expect it to ever be solved as the world continues to adapt and evolve. Additionally, this is only one example of the ethical debates that we will experience in security as it expands in scope, scale, and importance. Malware research, exploit development, and OSINT tools are all areas that we can have similar discussions, and I think it's extremely important that we keep those discussions alive. Also reinforce my personal belief in having a home lab. You likely don't want to go through the technical and bureaucratic hurdles of being able to test these tools anywhere near a corporate environment. Even just being able to run Bloodhound would be a nightmare for me to get authorized. However, it's quite straightforward to make great use of OST in a home lab where you have complete control and can keep things simple. Set up a small Windows network, turn on some security instrumentation like an IDS, Sysmon, and log collection, and run a few different C2 frameworks. What do you find? What do you see? What are different ways that you might detect this in the real world? Because it's pretty representative of how they work. Experiment with some post-exploitation and find stuff that stands out. So I've barely touched on many technical aspects of OST that are fascinating. I really enjoy discussing it, and I'm definitely excited to learn more from everybody, especially those that are more on the offensive and red team side. So find me and we'll talk passionately about this nerdy stuff. Some closing thoughts that I really liked was the Faction C2 shutdown. So recently, a developer of a command and control framework called Faction decided to shut down the project and left us with a message that I think is very powerful and basically summarizes what I've talked about. So, quote, most OST development is focused on novel tricks or the latest attack vector, a constant escalation of capabilities. Developing a novel technique is done in a vacuum, and if the developer does spend any time researching and documenting detection around a technique, expanding the detection to a network more than 100 endpoints is typically a non-trivial task. Developing mature detection and response capabilities in an organization is a monumental effort, and it's not a big surprise that most organizations struggle to catch boring attacker techniques, creating scheduled tasks, adding local users to computers, modifying groups, etc. And while these organizations struggle to keep up, the barrier to entry on being an advanced attacker gets lower and lower as new tools and techniques come out. It's easy to take the approach that these organizations are struggling with InfoSec or get what's coming to them. Well, maybe they should take InfoSec seriously if they don't want to get hacked, or the attacker could have just as easily used tool X instead of tool Y. The line of thought doesn't sit right with me, is a step removed from saying that some place deserved to get hacked. No organization deserves to be hacked, and same as no one person deserves to have their purse snatched. Victim blaming is short-sighted and doesn't help anyone. So if most organizations can't effectively detect boring or common attacker techniques, what value are we providing by making it easier to do this advanced stuff? To develop tooling that is focused on being undetectable and highly impactful. That's not to say that there is no value in OSTs. They can help to test the security postures. They help to challenge assumptions in detection. I think that the number of organizations that are able to get value out of OSTs is very small, though. The majority of the value in these releases are for people who don't have or want to invest the resources to develop a given technique or tool. Sometimes this is small pen test shops or InfoSec departments. Sometimes this is some script kiddie that's ransomwaring a hospital. I can't control how the tooling I develop is used. I can't control if it's used as part of a pen test against a Fortune 500 or as a way to hack a small regional bank in some city. I can, however, decide what I contribute to the world, and I've decided that I don't want to contribute to projects that are designed for attacking. Ultimately, this is why I decided to take down Faction. I did the math on how many people could be helped by Faction and how many people could be hurt by Faction and decided that I didn't like the numbers. I'd encourage people developing OSTs to do a similar analysis, and your project will be used maliciously. What are you okay with? I don't fault anyone for coming to a different conclusion than I did, but it's absolutely something that any offensive tooling developer should give serious thought to. So that's it. Hopefully that was at least a helpful overview of what OST is, and you're more equipped to have discussions about Cobalt Strike and all of that fun stuff. And thanks for letting me ramble.